My name is Steve. I'm the pastor of our East Campus, and I'm filling in for Ron today. It's always a pleasure to be here. I just want to start off by asking you guys a question this morning. Have you ever started something that you didn't finish? Ever started that before? When I was a kid, I thought I had this brilliant idea. My cousin was a drummer. And I thought, that looks really cool. I want to try that. Tell me how to do it. So he gave me this little pad and a couple of drumsticks, and he gave me a little drill to do. And I took it home, and I literally lasted less than a minute when I realized I had no musical talent whatsoever, so drums wasn't going to work for me. I had another friend, I talked to him, and he said he wanted to be an astronaut when he was a kid. And I'm like, well, everybody wants to be an astronaut. He says, no, really. He says, I had it all set up. I was ready to go to school, going to do this big thing. I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, two things. He said, number one, I had a girlfriend, and she wasn't for it. And then he said, number two, I found out I was afraid of heights. That never goes well if you're going to be an astronaut. In Jesus' time, there were some people who started following and didn't finish. Now, what I want to do, I just want to tell you guys, I'm going to give you the gospel in like 2 minutes, just a quick overview of the gospel. So I want you guys just to understand a few things here. The first thing is this: everybody is invited to follow Jesus. Everybody's invited to follow Jesus. When Jesus is preaching, you can see this in the 4th chapter of the book of Mark. He's preaching, a lot of people are closing in on him. There's a big crowd. He gets near a sea, has to go rent a boat, and he preaches from the sea. And then he just invites people to follow him. Now, whenever you're invited to follow Jesus, the next thing is following Jesus is an invitation to a relationship, not a religious code of ethics. So Jesus doesn't talk a whole lot about do's or don'ts, but he talks about how to get to know people. He says, get to know me, the living person of Christ, and follow in my footsteps. And you'll notice that things will actually change. The third thing is this: being a sinner is a prerequisite. Jesus called the most notorious sinners to his inner circle. There was a guy named Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector. Everybody hated tax collectors. And Matthew's a tax collector, and Jesus calls Matthew to follow him. Another thing, being a believer or having doubts is a prerequisite. There were no believers in that day. Everybody was questioning things. People weren't believers. Some people doubted to the very end. And the final thing is this: Jesus doesn't call us to magic. He calls us to trust. Let me explain this. When I was growing up in our neighborhood, in our area, there was a predominant religious denomination. And one of the things that we were always told, if you were going to sell your house, and some of you will understand this, if you were going to sell your house, what you would do is you would go out and you would get you a statue. And the statue would be Saint Joseph, right? And here's what you did. What you did was you would bury St. Joseph. There was like rules to how to do this. You would bury St. Joseph so your house would sell. You would bury him head down, facing your house near the for sale sign. And then you had these prayers that you would pray. And here, the prayer was like, you pray to St. Joseph, and if you have enough faith, then your house will sell. But if you don't have enough faith in St. Joseph, then your house won't sell. So basically, it's never St. Joseph's fault. It's always your fault if your house doesn't sell, right? It just always works that way. Now, here's the other thing. If your house did sell, you were required to go dig up the St. Joseph statue and take it home and put it in a place of honor. The biggest problem was if it took a long time to sell, you forgot where you buried the statue, and you would be in somebody's yard digging up a hole. Now, listen, that's magic. Jesus doesn't call us to magic. He calls us to trust. When he's on the boat with his disciples and they're freaking out about drowning, he says, why do you fear? What are you worried about? See, Jesus calls us to all of these things, and that's the gospel. But in the gospel, there's another thing. Some people unfollow Jesus, and that's what I'm talking about today. There's a temptation to step away, a temptation to follow. And the younger you are, the more important it is to hear this message. But even if you've been walking with Jesus for a while, it's important to hear this message because we're always faced with this dilemma. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start up in the 6th chapter of the book of John. And here's how it went. Jesus is preaching to a huge crowd of people, right? There's a huge crowd of people that he's preaching to. And he's telling them all kinds of stuff, and he's got this great sermon going on. There's like 5,000 people there, and they're super excited about it. They stay for a long time, but they get really, really, really hungry, okay? So his disciples walk up to Jesus and say, Jesus, look, there's all these people here, and they're hungry. We don't have anything to eat. Well, Jesus sees this kid walking by. He's got a Long John Silver's bag full of fish. He says, hey, bring that up here. And so he blesses it, and all of a sudden, he takes this one little bit of fish, and everybody eats for a long period of time. And people are like going, wow, Jesus, you are the bomb. This is so cool. Let's open up a restaurant. We can save on food costs. There's nothing like this. So everybody's beginning to love Jesus, right? Well, Jesus knows that this is just kind of a novelty thing. And he knows they're just kind of in it for the magic, in it for the tricks. And Jesus is like, so he slips away. And he goes to a place called Capernaum. And he goes to this synagogue. And he begins to preach, and people find out that he's there. And so they kind of gather in and they crowd in, and then they kind of like look at Jesus, oh, here he is again. And then they start yelling out to him, hey, Jesus, show us a sign, do another trick, show us a miracle, spit in somebody's eye and make them see. We love that stuff. This is the coolest stuff in the world. Let's stay with that. We really like that. Well, Jesus says, look, here's the thing. You know that food that I gave you guys? That food that I gave you, you'll be hungry for again. But listen, there's a bread that comes from heaven. And if you partake of that bread, you'll never be hungry again. And then Jesus goes on to talk about Moses, and he goes on to talk about manna. And then he goes on to say, listen, I'm the bread that came down from heaven. And they start, wait a minute, no, you're not. We know your mama. Her name was Mary. We know your daddy. His name was Joseph. You didn't come down from heaven. But Jesus continues to press in because he knows he's got their attention, and he uses this as a teaching moment. Let's read what happens. It's in John 6, 54 and 55. I'm going to have you guys read this with me. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. So the disciples are sitting there, and they're listening, and they're looking, and they can see that this is making people really, really uncomfortable. You have to remember, Jesus is like at rock star status at this point. People love him wherever he goes. And the disciples, they reap the benefits. The 12 closest, they're reaping the benefits of this. People are loving them. They love the popularity, so they're saying, Jesus, maybe you ought to calm down a little bit. Maybe you ought to tell them a parable. Nobody really understands your parables anyway. Just tell them a parable. Don't talk about this kind of stuff. This is cannibalism. I mean, people are taking their little kids and ushering out of the auditorium at this point. I mean, it brings a whole new level, a whole new meaning to the Vampire Diaries. This is weird stuff. We don't really get it. We don't really understand what's going on. So listen to this in verse 60. On hearing it, many of his disciples says, this is hard teaching. Who can accept it? Basically, here's what they're saying. We don't get it. This is deep stuff. We don't really understand. This is somewhat offensive to us. Verse 61. So Jesus goes on to say this. Read it with me. Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, does this offend you? And they're like going, you know what? It does offend us. And Jesus is saying, listen, is this too deep for you? Is this offensive? Is this too much? Am I oversharing here? Here's what you have to understand. This is spiritual stuff that I'm giving you. You're going to hunger for the food that I gave you way back then. But when you partake of what I'm talking about, things are going to change for your life. And here's the other thing. There are a lot of you who are following me, and you've hardened your heart. No matter what I do, you're never, ever going to believe. You're dead set against me. You're never going to believe. Verse 64, here's what it says. Yet there are some of you, and this is Jesus talking, who do not believe. For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. So what you're seeing here, right here at this point, is a pivotal moment in the ministry of Jesus. Pivotal moment right here. He's trying to sort through people right here, and then it happens. Verse 66. Read it with me. From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. They unfollowed. They hit the unfollow button. They deleted him from Facebook. They took his cell phone number out of their cell phones. So they said, hey, we don't want any part of this. This is way too much. So they went back to whoever, wherever, or whatever they came from. They simply walked away. And the 12 are there, and they're seeing this go on. They're like, oh my gosh, we've lost the crowd here. This is no longer going to be fun. And they're thinking to themselves, maybe I ought to just stand up and stretch and act like I got to go to the bathroom, and maybe I'll leave too. Maybe I'll get out of this whole thing. And then Jesus asked them a question. Verse 67, you don't want to leave too, do you? And you can hear the pain, the humanity of Jesus right here. His friends are thinking of betraying him. You don't want to leave too, do you? And here's what they knew. They knew that you didn't lie to Jesus because he would answer your questions before you ask him. So they knew you couldn't tell a lie. So this guy, Peter, this guy who just blurts out things most of the time, the same guy that Jesus just healed his mother-in-law, and Peter's probably a little conflicted about that whole thing, but Jesus just healed his mother-in-law. Peter, in this brilliant little way, he says something absolutely amazing here. Here's what he says. Simon Peter answered him. Read the rest with me. Lord, to whom shall we go? He evaluated the situation and he asked the question, to whom shall we go? Look, you got the key. You got the keys to eternal life here. Jesus says, you want to go too, do you? And Peter says, where are we going to go? What can we do? Peter understood something, and it's this. When you choose to unfollow Jesus, you choose to follow something or someone else. You choose to follow something or someone else. Peter recognized this, and he valued the situation. He got to look at it, and he realized that when you unfollow Jesus, you step down, you step out, you step away. If not Jesus, who? If not Christianity, then what? Jesus. You have the words of eternal life. The question is this: to whom shall I go? To whom shall I go? So with all that said, I just want to touch on a parable. I'm going to go over to the 15th chapter of Luke, and we're going to look at a parable. We're going to look at a young man who is home with his family, who is following his father, who unfollowed. And the metaphor of this parable is the father is God, and the son sometimes is us, and the elder brother is us. But we're just going to look at the younger son. So if you guys would stand with me, and we will honor God by standing and reading his word, Luke 15, starting in verse 11. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death. You guys can be seated. So in this parable, we're just going to look at this kid and this young man, and we're going to see why a guy would unfollow. First, it would be wonder. This kid simply wondered. Jesus continued. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided the property between them. Now, here's the thing. What caused this kid to wonder? He was probably sitting at home watching TV, saw a commercial for Las Vegas, and it said, everything that happens or anything that happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And he's like, I want to go there. I want to check. I wonder if that would be better than where I'm at. Dad, can I go? And his dad says, no, you can't go. So he took offense. Then he goes to his dad and he says, Dad, give me my share of the estate. Now, here's what you have to understand. In that day, in that time, a father in that era would never, ever, ever divide up his estate. It would be totally offensive. The question is totally offensive. So basically, here's what the kid's saying. Dad, look, I know that you worked really hard. I know that you've got a great reputation in the community. I know that you've built up all this property and all this land. But basically, Dad, here's the thing. You won't let me do what I want to do. So when he asked the question, here's basically what he was saying. Dad, you're dead to me. You're dead to me. I want my stuff. It's as if he asked his father to die. I want my stuff, and I want it now. He didn't understand Proverbs 20:20. Let's read this together. If someone curses their father or mother, their lamp will be snuffed out in pitch darkness. If he would have read that, he probably wouldn't have did this, because he's going to help me answer the question, to whom shall I go? And when this kind of stuff happens, there are times for each and every one of us where we have to look at things, and we'll see there are times in our lives where we will be tempted to unfollow. So if you're taking notes, here's the first time that we're tempted to unfollow, and it's transitional. Write that word in. It's in transition. It's a time of transition. Here's basically what it is. It's from grade school to middle school to high school to college to the first job. It's from when you move from St. Louis to Chicago or Minnesota to St. Louis, and things aren't the same anymore, but I'm in transition. And listen, back home, when you were with your family, when you were with your friends, everybody went to church together and they went out to eat. And it was always a great day, but here it's not like people are against Christianity in the situation or in the transition that I'm in. It's not like they're against Christianity. They're just not for it. It's not like they don't believe in Jesus. It just doesn't matter anymore. It's way easier to go out and party with people or go do something else. So the first time, the first chance, the first temptation is transitional. The second one is relational. It's not always the transition, but sometimes it's the relationship. And here's what I mean by that. Because, listen, and this happens when you're younger, because he's so cute, but he's not a Christian. But I'll convert him. Or she is so like, whoa, hot, oh my gosh. And listen, not everybody can be like, whoa, hot, oh my gosh, but everybody could be a Christian, so I'll convert her. And then you kind of fall in love, and then kind of like these things happen, and Jesus doesn't want you to do these certain things, and he's kind of getting in the way, and so you have this temptation to unfollow. Things aren't like they're supposed to be, and maybe I'll follow when I'm old again. I'll unfollow now and I'll follow when I'm old, because when you're old, there's nothing else to do but go to church, right? The third thing is this: it's situational. So it's transitional, it's relational, and it's situational. And here's what I mean by that. We're following, we're in church, but every now and then I just check out. Every now and then I'm just not there. Listen, I'm at this new job, I'm at this position, and I go with the group and they want us to have a drink, and one drink, turns into two, and two turns into 10, and next thing I know, it's 2 a.m. in the morning, and I'm singing karaoke up on the bar, and when I wake up the next day, I'm feeling pretty bad about myself, and I'm like, oh man, I shouldn't do that anymore. It's a situation that happens, and you're praying for something, and God is not answering. And God, listen, I've been faithful. I've continued to be faithful. God, you're not faithful to me. And maybe because of that, I simply have this thought, and the thought is simply to unfollow. Now, it's not like just a direct thought, like I'm going to unfollow. It's kind of a subtle little thing, and maybe I'll just not show up, or I'll show up every now and then. And Jesus is here looking at you today, and here's what he's asking. He's asking this question. The question is this: you're not thinking of leaving too, are you? You're not thinking of leaving too, are you? See, you got to understand, you can be in church today and you can still be unfollowing. You could be further away than you were before. You hear about the little boy, he's in the back seat standing up, and his dad's driving the car. His dad turns around and says, Johnny, sit down. He drives a little further. Dad looks back. The kid's still standing up in the back of the car. He said, Johnny, I told you to sit down. The kid still doesn't sit down. Drives a little further. His dad looks back and he says, Johnny, I've told you twice, and I'm not going to tell you again. I will pull this car over and I will spank your butt if you don't sit down. Johnny's a smart kid, so he finally sits down. He's a little mad about it. He looks at his dad and he said, Dad, let me tell you something. I'm sitting down on the outside, but on the inside, I'm standing up. A lot of times we do that. We're sitting down on the outside, but on the inside, we're standing up. Sometimes it's just this natural rebellion that we have. Now, the second thing, first thing is wonder. The second thing is fun. Kid just wanted to go have some fun. It's another reason to unfollow. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth, read the rest with me, in wild living. Kid wanted to go have some fun. Look at the definition of the prodigal. Recklessly extravagant, having spent everything. Let's just face it, Hebrews 11:25 tells us something. Sin is fun for a season. It's the consequences that get us. Sin's fun for a season. In the story of the prodigal son, it's exceedingly important to understand the mercy and grace involved in the father's decision to let the son go. The God in the universe, who's represented in the father of this story, has a message for us today. He's saying, listen, I love you, so you're free. You're free to go. You're free to do what you want to do, but just remember, there are consequences for your actions. I walked into Schnucks this week. My wife and I were going to the store. I saw somebody there from our church, and really nice lady, I like her, and she told me, hey, do you know those two kids that you prayed for, that you pray for all the time? I said, I do. See, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but in this area, there's a heroin epidemic. There's a drug epidemic. It's unbelievable. And I run across a lot of people who are hooked on this, and they'll come and I'll talk to them, and my heart goes out to them because they're struggling with this whole thing. And so a couple of weeks ago, a young man was in my office, and I prayed for him. And I said, yeah, I remember praying for him. And she said, well, they're in jail right now. And I said, really? I said, I prayed for them a couple weeks ago. She goes, yeah, I went to see him, and he said, it's your fault. I said, it's my fault. How could it be my fault? He said, well, when you prayed that whatever had to happen to get him clean and sober, that's what had to happen. It really is a great way to keep people out of your office when you pray those type of prayers. Thing about it, my heart goes out to the kid, though. But when I would talk to him, he would just tell me. He would just tell me things. He said, you don't understand what this drug does to you. I said, son, listen, let me tell you something. Do you understand that you're going to die if you keep going in this direction? Without batting an eye, he looked at me and said, yes. Without batting an eye, he knew it. You guys wouldn't believe the epidemic that goes on. These people have died, and they've been brought back to life. They die, literally die from taking this drug. And I'm talking to him, and he's telling me these secrets. And here's the thing. Think about that, and I think about my secrets. I think about the things that I've done. I think the things that you've done that you don't want anyone to know about. And they started out as fun. You didn't think it'd be a big deal. Maybe it's a word you said to somebody. Maybe you disrespected your parents, or you disrespected your kids, or you talked to your spouse in a disrespectful way. Maybe there's some choices that you've made that affected other people, and you've never told anybody about it. When we get to that point, it breaks our heart, and it festers on the inside of us. And there's a point where we need to confess those things to God, when we need to go to those people and fix it in the best way we can, if that's possible. See, the God of the universe could pirate us around the neck, could change our will and say, listen, you're going to do what I tell you to do. But in his grace and mercy, in his extraordinary grace and mercy, he never does that. Here's what he says to us. Have a great trip, son. Have a wonderful adventure, daughter. Now remember, you're walking out from the protection of my umbrella, so watch your backside, because you never know what's going to happen. But remember this also. No matter where you go, no matter what you've done, always remember that the light's going to be on at home, and I'll be waiting for you. You can come back anytime you want. You unfollowed now, but you could always refollow. Just don't wait too long, because sometimes you'll never see the light again. Proverbs 28, verse 7 says this, a discerning son heeds instruction, but a companion of gluttons disgraces his father. Be a discerning son. That's what he's saying here. So let's just see where this young man ends up. He ends up in what I call reality. Luke 15:17 says this. Read this part with me. When he came to his senses. When he came to his senses. He came to his senses, and he answers the question, to whom shall I go? And he's faced, one day he gets up and he's face to face in the mirror. And he has a come to Jesus meeting with himself, and he realizes where he's at. And let's look at where he's at. First, he ends up needy. And he began to be in need. One of the reasons he left in the first place was he wanted more. He wasn't content. He thought that someplace else was going to be better. But then he realized it wasn't better. More is not always better. More is just more problems a lot of times. More sometimes equal less. And he says, I thought that I would find contentment, but I'm ending up needy. Psalm 70, verse 5. Read it with me. But as for me, I am poor and needy. Come quickly to me, O God. You are my help and my deliverer. Lord, do not delay. The second thing he ends up needy first, then he ends up muddy. He goes to this guy who sent him to his field to feed pigs. And listen, when you roll around in the mud with pigs, the only thing you end up is muddy. That's all you get out of it. But the Bible said he ground through his entire money pile by living, and the word they use is squandered. He blew it. So here's this kid. He's out of money, he's out of friends, he's out of food, he's out of luck. He's a tad out of sorts in his life. And for the first time in his young life, it's a reality check. He ends up flat on his back in the mud looking up. And sometimes that's the best place to be. Psalm 69:14, rescue me from the mire. Do not let me sink. Deliver me from those who hate me, from the deep waters. Read the next one, Psalm 72:12. Read this with me. For he will deliver the needy who cry out, the afflicted who have no one to help. God always answers the prayer of the needy. And the final thing he ended up was hungry. And I would say he's spiritually hungry. He says, and here I am starving to death. I would say that he's physically hungry, but he's also spiritually hungry. I would say that he is out here and he's thinking about home, and he's thinking about his dad, and he's thinking about his family, and he's thinking about the things that they used to do, and he is longing for the fellowship of his Father. He's longing to be connected in a way that he was once connected. Proverbs 10:3, read it with me. The Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. See, in this story, God tells us something. He says you're free. You're free to follow, or you're free to unfollow. The choice is simply up to you. It's where you end up. That's the question. I'm going to close with a story. The story's about two guys. One guy's name's Charles Templeton. The other guy's name's Billy Graham. They were both evangelists at the time. They were both friends at the time. Charles Templeton at one point and Billy Graham came to this place that was a crisis of faith. Charles Templeton, he told Billy, he said, Billy, listen. He said, science has disproved the Bible. There's new things that we've discovered here. Science has disproved it. Billy says, I don't believe that, Charles. Charles says, but Billy, I'm going to leave. And Billy says, Charles, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. I'm going to stick with this. Charles went his way. He unfollowed. Billy went his way. Here's the story that's told by a guy named Lee Strobel. 50 years later, Lee Strobel had the opportunity to interview Templeton, who had just a couple more years left to live. He was in his 80s. In his case for faith, Strobel recounts the ending of their wide-ranging conversation, and they finally got to talk about Jesus. And how do you assess this Jesus, Strobel asked. Templeton's body language softened. His guard seemingly down, he spoke in an unhurried pace, carefully choosing his words as he talked about Jesus. He was, Templeton began, the greatest human being who has ever lived. He was a moral genius. His ethical sense was unique. He was intrinsically the wisest person that I've ever encountered in my life or in my readings. I was taken aback, said Strobel. You sound like you really care about him, Strobel said. Everything good I know, everything decent I know, everything pure I know, I learned from Jesus. There's no question that he had the highest moral standard, the greatest compassion of any human being in history. He went on, but no, he said slowly. He's the most. He stopped, then he started again. In my view, he declared, he is the most important human being who has ever existed. That's when Templeton uttered the words I never expected to hear from him. And if I may put it this way, he said, as his voice began to crack, I miss him. I miss him. With that, tears flooded his eyes. He turned his head and he looked downward, raising his left hand to shield his face from me. His shoulders bobbed as he wept. See, that's what the Christian faith is all about, friends. Billy Graham is still writing books, reaching out to people and making a difference for time and for eternity. Still hanging in there. Charles Templeton, he passed away a few years back. We're free to follow. We're free to unfollow. It's simply our choice. You probably have people in your life who've unfollowed. Christmas is a great time to ask them back. You may be on the verge yourself of thinking these things and like, oh, is it really worth it? God's not answering my prayers. Here's what I would tell you, hang in there, it's definitely worth it. Remember Peter? Peter said, where would we go? Right? He said, where would we go? Well, one time he's at this situation, he's got this point, and he said, Jesus, I'll follow you to the end. And then he's at this point, and he's a big, tough guy. And this third grade girl says, hey, you're one of them. And Peter says, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. He chose at that point to unfollow. But God, in his great mercy, in his great grace, brought Peter back into the fold.